Okay, so welcome everybody to this wonderful symposium in honor of Sergio Benvenuto's one of his most recent books, certainly the most recent book in English, Conversations with Lacan. Um, for those who don't know me, I'm Fernando Castrillon. I'm the editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Psychoanalysis. Of course, Sergio Benvenuto is the founding editor-in-chief and the editor-in-chief for 25 years. And so this is a lovely event put on both by the European Journal of Psychoanalysis and also the Foundation of California Psychoanalysis. So thank you to everyone for coming. I did want to note this event is being recorded and it'll be posted to the EJP. So I'll say EJP instead of the European Journal of Psychoanalysis. For brevity, it'll be posted to the EJP YouTube channel sometime in the next couple of weeks. So you can direct your friends and comrades to look at it there. I should also note that later in March, we'll be doing a similar event for Nestor Bronstein's book on jouissance, a Laconian concept, which the new translation of that has been done into English. It's put up by SUNY Press. It is a spectacular translation of a very important book. And so we'll be doing an event then as well. We will send out the details of that sometime soon. So, and we hope to have many more of these, right? Highlighting works that are coming out in psychoanalysis. Okay, so let me give you a quick overview of our time together today. We have 6 speakers, which I will name in just a little bit, presenting, and of course, starting with Sergio. At the end of the presentations, we will open it up and we can have a general discussion. I did want to note to folks that when we get to the discussion portion, I mean, you might not see it on your screen. I don't know if you can or you cannot, but there's an enormous amount of people here. So we cannot just open it up and everybody just start talking. I've tried that before in classrooms. It doesn't necessarily work. And so what I will ask you to do is that if you do want to speak, if you want to make a comment or a question, if you look at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, it says participants. And if you click on it, you'll see something that says raise hand. If you hit that, it'll show a little hand. I will see the hand. When I see the hand, and then I will call on you, okay? And then, of course, you can unmute your microphone, and then you will be able to speak. I will moderate the discussion by calling only on those people who have raised their hand using that function. And we will wait to have a general discussion until after all our presenters have spoken. So it'll be in a couple of hours at least. So if you have a pressing question or comment, write it down, okay? And then we can work with it later. I will ask people to please keep your microphones muted until I've called on you during the general discussion at the end. One of the things that I'm sure many of you have noticed during Zoom calls or meetings is that if somebody has their mic on, then you can hear the cars in the background and the machine, different machines and stuff like this. So please keep your microphone off unless you've been called on to speak. Okay, so that's the logistics and the agenda for our time together today, these 3 hours. I do want to thank the speakers, first of all, that we have lined up today: Patricia Gherovici, Lou Rose, David Lichtenstein, and Emma Lieber. They have very generously given of their time and energy to be able to bring us together and have an event symposium of this sort. Our first speaker, of course, is Sergio Benvenuto. So let me say a few sort of introductory remarks about Sergio, and then he will begin. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Sergio. His contributions to the field of psychoanalysis, philosophy, social thought, and other fields are immense, and they continue unabated. Some background on Sergio. His interests are reflected in his three professions: psychoanalyst, philosopher, and essayist. Although he has others. For example, I've come to find out over the years that he's also been a journalist, among other things. So he's been a busy man. After completing his maîtrise in psychology at the University of Paris 7 in 1973, he went on to complete a laurea in sociology with a thesis on insanity in 1976 at the Universidad de Urbino. He also did doctoral work with Jean Laplanche. He is a former researcher at the Institute of Cognitive Technologies and Sciences of the National Research Council in Rome. He is president of the Istituto Elvio Facchinelli, also known as the Institute of Advanced Studies in Psychoanalysis, in Rome, and founded in 1995, so 25, at this point, 26 years ago, the European Journal of Psychoanalysis. He functioned as the editor during that entire time, the editor-in-chief. He is an editorial board member of American Imago, collaborated with and continues to contribute to a number of cultural journals scattered throughout the world, such as Telos, Lettre Internationale, Text, Journal for Laconian Studies, The Vision Review, and many others. As well, he translated Jacques Lacan's Seminar 20, Encore, into Italian. No small task. He has published books in many languages on psychoanalysis, philosophy of science, philosophy of politics, and social psychology. His books in English include With Antonio Molino and Freud's Tracks, nominated for the Gradiva Award, What Are Perversions with Carnac, and of course, the one that we're focusing on today, Conversations with Lacan, published by Routledge this past year. Please join me in welcoming Sergio Benvenuto.
Thank you, Fernando, for your presentation. For this monument, for this obituary monument, in a certain way, you presented. It's true that I'm quite old anyway. Of course, I thank European Journal of Psychoanalysis and the Foundation of California Psychoanalysis for inviting me to present my latest book in English. I have to confess a trick that I already read some of the presentation. Some of our friends wrote. Excuse me. Also, I apologize for my English. I don't live in America. My English is maybe a little bit scholastic, but I hope that it will be comprehensible for you, even if it's a rough English. Anyway. I had the opportunity to read some of the presentation. It's a little bit trick, and it's why I already know the question which will be raised about my book and by a certain illegitimate maneuver. I will try to answer before the question will be raised, but of course we can come back to these questions. I will try just a very rough answer. I am impressed, not only in this case, reading the presentations, but in general, when my books, even in Italy, in the countries, the countries are presented, the attention on the title of my books. I think that it's a very psychoanalytic. I mean, the title is something which always expresses some unconscious. And I don't know why, but the titles of my books intrigue persons, Of course, people ask why conversation with Lacan. And why 7 conversation? Somebody also asked about why 7 or not 6 or 8. No, and it's true that this English book was in a certain way a reedition of a previous Italian book, which was a real conversation with the young philosopher about Lacan. And even in this case, there were 7 conversations. Maybe it's a pure chance, who knows? But maybe this 7 is quite a strange signifier. I have to say that in some of these signifiers, the title, Conversation with Lacan, come from the big other. You know that according to Lacan, big other is the unconscious. But it does mean, according to Lacan, that the only big other is the unconscious. Unconscious, certainly, Lacan said that unconscious is the discourse by the big other, but big other is not just only unconscious. It can be also a publisher. In this case, the publisher is Routledge, and I have to confess that the title was proposed by the publisher Routledge, who is not the my idea, my naive idea, it was to write something completely non-academic. Now, conversation, for me, it was the contrary of the academic discourse, the tactatus, I mean, the lecture where you talk to your colleagues. My idea, it was to converse with an unspecialized audience. But conversation, it's not a dialogue. Louis Rose will talk about, I mean, his idea of my book. I anticipate his thought. He thinks that in a certain way, my book deals essentially with the dialogue, no? On the background of the idea that essentially psychoanalysis is a form of dialogue. But if the publisher would have proposed dialogue with Lacan, I would have absolutely refused this title. Why? Because dialogue, it's always like Socratic dialogue. No? The model is the Socratic the dialogue. It's a conversation between two real persons. One asks, the other responds. But I don't think that my aim was to talk, to dialogue with other people. I have a lot of other dialogues with friends, of course, but it wasn't my aim to have a dialogue. Even if Lacan in the seminar 7 on transference said clearly that according to him, Socrates was the first psychoanalyst, but certainly the Socratic dialogue is not at all what I would tell the psychoanalytic conversation. Why? In fact, my conversation is with whom? I said with with the reader of a course. But you know, I would say more frankly that essentially my conversation with the ghost of Lacan were in fact a conversation with myself. The real conversation is not with another person, but with myself. But the point with myself with whom I converse, or I wanted to converse. In fact, this myself with whom I converse on Lacan, it's 50 years that I converse with myself about Lacan. Never with Lacan because I met him, but I never had a dialogue with him. Huh? With this myself. This myself is essentially another. I was impressed by what Heidegger, the famous philosopher, said about his way of thinking. He said that when we think philosophically, we converse always with our friend, our dear friend. Not in the sense that the friend is there, but on the contrary, he's absent. The friend is absent, but we converse with them. We need the friend with whom to converse, but it's not important that the friend exists, is there. And if I ever to tell you, you know, a sort of a very personal confession, personally, when I think about psychoanalysis, philosophy, everything, I converse with my father. My father was also a philosopher, died in 1933, long time ago. But in fact, I can think only because I talk with them, but not in the sense that it's a dialogue, because my father is dead, and of course he never tells me anything. The real interlocutor of a conversation does not tell anything, no? But you need them. You need to talk to another, and it gives an idea of what Lacan means by the big other. The big other is not others with whom you have a dialogue, a conversation, a concrete conversation, but sorry, but you need a dialogue with a big other, which by definition does not exist. It's the real point. It's not a dialogue between real person, like in Socratic dialogue, but it's a conversation with the big other who does not exist. We have some examples which come to my memory. For example, I don't know if you saw this movie of the 80s, old movie by Lars von Trier, Breaking Waves, and the protagonist, a woman, often talks with God. Of course, God is not there. She also acts the voice of a God. But for her, it's essential to think only if she talks with God. Why? Because God certainly is a metaphor of the unconscious, but not only unconscious, it's big other. And I was thinking in these days about the QAnon. You are very competent about QAnon, this sect which are organized essentially the attack to the Capitol in Washington. And you know that QAnon is convinced that America is ruled essentially by pedophiles from a pizza parlor. No, it's very easy to make an easy psychoanalysis and to interpret all this easily as paranoia, as projection, identification. You know, it's a little bit very, I mean, overused game. I would say that maybe for the QAnon, the pedophile organization, he's the big other. It's the unconscious, in the sense that maybe they consider all as children harassed and abused by the powerful pedophiles. In a certain sense, these crazy cults, I mean cults or sect of fanatics, they need a big other in the form of an abusing big other, and they are the children who have to react to this abuse. Huh? Why 7 conversation? I don't know. Even this comes from the big other, but in the sense, not the publisher, but maybe my own unconscious. 7 days, it's a week. Maybe I think that essentially my book should be read in a week. Each chapter every day, but week in our culture has a very vast meaning. The week, it's the time, 7 days, which God used to build, to create the world. 7 days, the week is the idea itself of a creation. Maybe I thought unconsciously that I was a god to create my book, but I don't think that at the 7th day I will rest. I mean, I don't think that I will rest like a god. Another question, Castrillon said, will say that this my book is its aim is not popularizing a vulgarization of Lacan's thought, no, and I think he's completely right. You know, my idea, it wasn't what it all popularization, which means to transmit some basic signifiers to people in order that common people can repeat these Lacanian signifiers. You know, I don't like popularization. You know, another of my master is Wittgenstein. Some can find strange to have as a master Wittgenstein and Lacan, who seem so opposite to opposite side of the thought. But in fact, Lacan had a great admiration for Wittgenstein, and he dedicated one seminar to report his reading of the Tractatus by Wittgenstein. and it's why I don't find strange that I can be also Wittgensteinian and Lacanian. It's not opposite. And Wittgenstein hated popular science writings. He thought that it was a real bullshit. That vulgarization of modern physics, for example, it was a cheat. And he wrote, popular science writings do not reflect the hard work carried out by our scientists, but rather the resting on their laurels. No, and when I wrote this book, I did want to rest on my laurels, like a god in the Bible. I didn't want to write my book on the seventh days on Sunday. Now, you have to explain people who are not in the scientific game, people who don't do psychoanalysis, who are curious about psychoanalysis, but they don't have experience of the real analysis, that lot of divulgation, Reader's Digest books on psychoanalysis, it's not real psychoanalysis. It's just resting. It's just maybe sleeping in psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much I have as time. Maybe still 50 minutes.
You have 9 minutes still.
I mean, okay. I would also tell that this book has a lot of mistakes. I was surprised that a lot of things that I had corrected, they weren't corrected by the publisher. It's a long list, but especially I would like to concentrate on, and it's why I warn you when you read especially banal sentences, maybe have some doubts. Maybe it's a misprint, the most shocking for me, it was a quotation from Saint Augustine. I wrote, Saint Augustine said that we must love. It's a very banal sentence, no? That Saint Augustine said that we must love. In fact, my real quotation was Saint Augustine said that we must love, twice love, love as a verb and love as a substantive. But maybe the publisher computer interpreted a repetition of a word as a mistake, and it cut the second love. Of course, it has completely another sense. One thing it's to love, other thing it's to love. I don't know if there was a computer machine which raised the second love, but I think it's an important point in Lacan's view of the language and of the signifier, because in a certain way the signifier appears rarely, always when there is a repetition. We must love. At this point, the signifier appears. It's like it's just like when Tony Blair many years ago, launched the slogan, our solution is education, education, education. Some Brits didn't understand this because it was too much signifier. No, repetition is the mark of the signifier. For example, in the famous film Matrix, the first movie Matrix, it's quite interesting. You know the story. The hero, the protagonist, the one at certain point has the experience of the same scene, a cat which is, going out from the door. It's the absolutely the same scene, and he concludes it's not a real. It's a matrix. It's a machine. It's a signifying machine which is imposing this repetition of this stupid scene. No, because the repetition is the mark of the signifier, and it's why the banalization of even journalistic literature, it's always to erase everything which imposes us the opacity of the signifier. It's why psychoanalysis is not a dialogue, because you have to deal with the opacity of the signifier. And I would say, finishing that, you know, it's a very nice experience with the translation. Many times I ask a translator to translate in different languages my text, and sometimes they are very good translator, very careful, but often they make terrible mistakes, not because they're not expert, but because unconsciously they try to erase, to kill the signifier. And the result of the translation is always banality. Just to give an example, you know, I published an article which title is "I age, therefore I am not." I age, therefore I am not. And the very good translator in English translated "I age, therefore I am." Why? Because in Descartes, it's I think, then I am, no? And the attraction of the banality of what you know, you repeat, you heard 100 times, no? It has like a magnet, attracts translators who don't want, who find unconsciously resistance to give room to the signifier, because in this case, like in We Must Love Love, therefore I'm not, was strange, weird. And you know, to conclude, what's the essential charm of a Lacanian thought? We can be against many of his ideas, but you know, his merits, like in poetry, in literature, is to tell us focus on signifiers, focus on repetition, focus on what is completely new. It's completely, I would say, creative. And it's why he was, I think, the only psychoanalyst who gave a great importance to an almost, unknown text by Freud, The Joke and its Relationship with the Unconscious, where the joke, the humor, the sense of humor, creativity, the capacity through the signifier to create new combinations, new sense is linked to the unconscious. According to the unconscious, is not just the repressed garbage, according to many schools, but unconscious is a creation of the signifier. It's the source of a creativity. And, but this creativity is quite hard for many to tolerate. I would like to finish. I started by a quotation of Wittgenstein. I would like to finish just by another quotation by Wittgenstein. He was talking about scientists, about the work of scientists, but we can extend to all kinds of intellectual work. What you succeeded in doing cannot signify anything more for others than it does for yourself. Others will pay as much as it cost you. If you want to understand Lacan, you have, to pay the price you paid.
Thank you, Sergio. Okay, so we continue. So hopefully we will find threads from presentation to presentation. That's the hope and the background work we did on this. So our next speaker is Patricia Gherovici. So let me give a few words by way of introduction. Patricia, PhD, Patricia Gherovici, PhD, is a psychoanalyst and analytic supervisor. She is co-founder and director of the Philadelphia Lacan Group and associate faculty psychoanalytic studies minor at the University of Pennsylvania. She is an honorary member at IPTAR, New York City, and founding member of Das Unbehagen. Her books include The Puerto Rican Syndrome, from the Other Press in 2003, which won both the Gradiva Award and the Boyer Prize. Please Select Your Gender, From the Invention of Hysteria to the Democratizing of Transgenderism with Rutledge in 2010. And Transgender Psychoanalysis, a Lacanian Perspective on Sexual Difference in 2017, also with Rutledge. She has co-edited 2 volumes with Manja Steinkohler, Lacan on Madness, Madness, Yes You Can't, with Rutledge in 2015, which, mind you, I'm actually using for a class this coming semester, and Lacan, Psychoanalysis and Comedy, with Cambridge University Press in 2016. Most recently, she published with Christian Psychoanalysis in the Barrios, Race, Class, and the Unconscious, which was a Gradiva Award finalist. That was also published with Rutledge. That was in 2019. And she is completing currently with Manja Steinkohler another book titled Psychoanalysis, Gender, and Sexualities, From Feminism to Trans, Little Star. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Gherovici.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Great. Opening the book, looking at the title, knowing that so I open the book, I look at the title, and knowing that the author had been present at Lacan's seminars and that he had met Lacan personally while a student in Paris, I imagine that Benvenuto would be among the many memoirists who distill for posterity the memory of their encounters with the master. But then I realized that this was not at all the format. By conversation, titled we heard just recently the background story, but that was the signifier that was proposed initially. It was a problem with the preposition, but not with the word conversation. And I think it's important, this word conversation, because I think we are closer to the German Auseinandersetzung or confrontation, which means a theoretical discussion allied with a succinct summary of where divergence ends to create consensus. So I couldn't resist the temptation, and I took a look at the etymology of the word conversation. In its English usage, it derives from the mid-14th century to mean place where one lives or dwells. Also, general course of actions or habits, manner of conducting oneself in the world. Both ends are now obsolete. In Old French, conversation meant behavior, way of life, monastic life. And directly from the Latin, conversationem, frequent use, frequent abode in a place, intercourse, conversation. A noun of action from the past participle stem of conversari, to live, dwell, live with, keep company with. The passive voice of conversare, to turn about with. The sense we use today of informal exchange of thoughts and sentiment by spoken words dates from the 1570s. But it was used as a synonym for sexual intercourse from at least late 14th century. Hence, criminal conversation, a legal term for adultery from the late 18th century. It is difficult to engage in conversation with a dead man unless we believe in spirits. So I will take from the rich polysemy of the word conversation and its historical resonance, the meaning way of life, and take this book as a lively testimony of the way of life of a psychoanalyst. As Benvenuto writes, as if to warn us against my previous philological excursus via semantic routes, he says that, quote, in psychoanalysis too, it is a mistake to think that everything that happens is the effect of the archaea of language, end quote. This is one of the several qualifications facing classical Lacanian orthodoxy. Late in the book, Benvenuto proposes to set aside Lacan's logocentrism, quote, the primal transcendentality of language, end quote. He's aware as well that the preceding chapters have highlighted the dominance of the signifier. What Benvenuto is questioning here is Lacan's consideration of language as a transcendental condition of subjectivity. Does this depend from what he called his deconstructive reading? On page 155, he calls himself a deconstructive Lacanologist. In what sense is this deconstruction at work? Here is one of my questions for him. Would Benvenuto be a covert Derridian? I don't think so. Even if he mentioned in this passage the wish to return both to Derrida and Agamben, perhaps to highlight that humans are animals. We all remember Derrida's queries and even attacks, the attempt to show how idealistic, Hegelian, and teleological Lacan was. There is a reference to Nancy Lacoulabart on page 64. We have not forgotten how they demonstrated that one cannot be a Saussurean and a Heideggerian at the same time. This does not seem to be Benvenuto's take. He seems to argue that the domination of language is a myth of the 60s, and he gives us a chilling account of a French Lacanian psychoanalyst who interprets the symptom of an Italian friend who felt responsible for his mother's knee pain as having to do with the signifier genou, a beautiful word game with J, I, and nous, we, but that was very well in French, but not really at all relevant for an Italian speaker. However, we also know that Derrida and Agamben do not agree about life, Zoe or bios, and the animal, or rather that Derrida dismissed Agamben's claims that the animal that therefore I am, in the element that therefore I am. So where are we exactly here? As speaking animals that we are, especially those animals who undergo analysis, the equivocal value of words should not be disregarded in the cure. We should, however, try not to indulge in what Benvenuto calls an abandonment into, quote, a modernistic sort of spiritualism, end quote, aware that the analytic intervention, quote, fits in logos, end quote. His intention is to highlight that despite the fact that we may get lost in words, we are also Zoe, life. With life, we open the way to an assessment of the true important issue, das Trieb, the drive, the force that transubstantiates into desire. One of Benvenuto's desires that one can see in the book is to tackle the real thing at stake in psychoanalysis, the real with capital R. And to accomplish this, he follows a path that is not derailed by the hubris of reading Lacan's, quote, dazzling mottos, end quote, as science, or exercising, quote, devotional philological preservation, end quote, and reconstructing meaning in, quote, militant exegesis of the sacred text, end quote. In fact, this trilogy, like that of Catholic theology, is 3 in 1, because the 3 modalities of reading are interdependent and could boil down to one. The, quote, simulation of scientific style, end quote, relies on the evidence and data from philological reconstruction and leads to a, quote, religious exegesis of the sacred text, end quote. This book is alive, and this is what I like of the book, that it is fresh, it is vibrant, it is always intelligent, and take us away from a devoted, myopic, interlinear gloss. Benvenuto knows his Lacan and distills the gist of his teaching. He's aware that Lacan's famous one-liners, even when they sound like definitions or even inspirational poster slogans, are parodies of definitions. Benvenuto gives, as one example, Lacan's definition of love as giving something you don't have to someone who doesn't want it, as, quote, a caricature of a definition of love. I have to say, maybe to enter the field of paradoxes, that, however, he devotes several pages of the book to develop this very quote, as well as many of Lacan's famous quotes. But I agree that these aphorisms give us some important cues, but as Benvenuto recommends, one should not take them too seriously, but rather play with their wit. I value this non-dogmatic approach that is prudent, it shows care and thought for the future, and I see it as a sincere gesture that highlights what of Lacan can be, quote, topical and alive, end quote, as he says. Lacan's aphorisms are often an excuse for devotional worship, as Benvenuto calls, militant exegesis of the text of the absolute, end quote. These pseudo-knowledges, as Benvenuto writes, are treated as, quote, traces of monuments of the past aimed at reaffirming religious truth. Like, play it against Sam in the film Casablanca, or do you feel lucky, punk, in the movie Dirty Harry. These are phrases that everyone quotes, but wrongly. Furthermore, some of the eternal truths of psychoanalysis are apocryphal or perhaps added post facto. Of note is the phrase that Benvenuto implicitly alludes to at the beginning of chapter 7, Waiting for Machiavelli, when he says that he is not a Lacanian or that he calls himself a Freudian. Thus, It was a surprise for me to discover that Lacan's famous phrase from July 1980 during the Caracas seminar, a little more than a year before his death, the phrase "C'est à vous d'être lacanien, moi je suis freudien," it's up to you to be a Lacanian. As for myself, I am a Freudian. And against all the dogma, Lacanian dogma built around it, was never pronounced by Lacan. As confirmed by two recent documentaries on that seminar available on YouTube, as well as a personal communication with Diana Rabinovich, the Argentine analyst, who at the time was living in exile in Venezuela and was the organizer of the Caracas seminar. This is a seminar in which famously Lacan gave to his Latin American readers the label of Lacanoamericanos. This famous phrase was added to the published version written, the three so-called written transcription of the oral presentation. And to cure us perhaps of this wish to fetishize the sacred text, I invite you to compare the actual film Televisión with the published text. You will notice many discrepancies. All this confirm the absurdity of the, quote, devotional philological preservation, as Benvenuto calls it, the absurdity of worshiping the absolute text. Benvenuto's tongue-in-cheek style reminds me of the humor of Lacan in The Situation of Psychoanalysis and the Training of Psychoanalysts in 1956. If I underline Benvenuto's style, it is in order to highlight that style reflects substance, that is, a beyond meaning, which is showing we can grasp in terms of Lacan theory of the real. This is something we can grasp in terms of Lacan theory of the real. But what about the real man when he was still alive? I mean, the man Benvenuto met on the flesh, the Jacques Lacan who Benvenuto, quote, never considered going into analysis with. I wonder why. To conclude, I have to say that I saw a plot in this collection of lectures that made them into a real book, maybe a novel with a secret. And the secret was only half revealed. On the first page, we read that Benvenuto writes, never consider going into analysis, end quote, with Lacan. He says he will give his reasons later. Indeed, one has to wait until this last chapter to read this quote. In my youth, I was a fervent Lacanian fan. Then, after overcoming my transference with him, I stopped being one, and for me, he was no longer the subject supposed to know, end quote. I have to say that I'm still curious. What happened then? Why was his analysis with Lacan, an analysis that never really took place in real life, ended long ago? Reading through those pages, I was wondering whether this had to do with the issue of the master, mentioned in page 158 in relation to difficulties in the transmission of psychoanalysis. I quote, what the master transmits is not so much a formal thinking, but a certain style of being in the world, an observation that leads to Benvenuto's controversial statement, quote, this is why about Lacan, one can only write introductions to his thoughts, end quote. Or is the problem more precisely the master voice that renders the written text alive? Benvenuto says that the seminars are like Pinter's theater plays, that once scene performs, they render the writing alive. I wonder about the way Benvenuto managed, nevertheless, to become a reputed Lacanian psychoanalyst. In one interesting clinical aside, he mentions an Italian patient who was hysteric and to whom he said, you're looking for a master to dominate. He was quoting Lacan's famous formula for hysteria. He concludes very cogently, quote, this was a turning point in her way of being, end quote. Elsewhere, he examines the links between being an analyst and being a master. He also highlights the danger of becoming pedantic, a sin he never commits in these pages, and falling into university discourse, which he cues as skillfully. However, he confesses that Lacan has been his maître, which works better in French as master and teacher. Why does he feel tender pity for those who never had a master and who are, quote, little orphans who have to steal hot dogs to survive, end quote? Did Benvenuto fear that he would have to be the slave facing his master? He declares that he's not a Lacanian because he preferred to do as Lacan did. In Rome, in 1974, Lacan famously declared, do as I do not imitate me. When in Rome, do as Romans do. His wonderful double bind would have been acted out by Benvenuto with a vengeance. Quote, I am an imitator of Lacan, hence not a Lacanian, page 156. Whatever it is, I sense that these remarks are important. Do we need to be like prodigal sons who betray the father and never return home with the tails between their legs? Or will be with our stolens, will be there with our stolen hot dogs in hands? What does Benvenuto mean while declaring his love for Lacan, his symptom, his joy and pain? These are real questions for me, and I would like to hear his answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much. So we will have time once all 6 presentations have for Sergio to be able to respond to these poignant and prescient questions. So it also gives you time to prepare, Sergio, right? Right.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Are you asking if I can answer now?
No. We can actually do that.
Okay.
Yeah, at the end of all the
later.
presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Okay.
Later.
Okay. So thank you, Patricia. Okay. So next on the docket, as it were, is Louis Rose. Dr. Rose is a professor of modern European history at Otterbein University and executive director of the Sigmund Freud Archives. He received his BA in history from Clark University, where Sigmund Freud delivered his American lectures, and his PhD in history from Princeton. His most recent book is Psychology, Art, and Anti-Fascism, Ernst Chris, E.H. Gombrich, and the Politics of Caricature from Yale, 2016, for which a Chinese translation is now in preparation. His first book, The Freudian Calling, Early Viennese Psychoanalysis and the Pursuit of Cultural Science, received the 1999 Austrian Cultural Institute Prize for Best Book in Austrian Studies. It was followed by The Survival of Images, Art Historians, Psychoanalysts, and the Ancients, 2001. From 2011 to 2018, he was editor of the Interdisciplinary Psychoanalytic Journal, American Imago. He is a member of the History of Psychoanalysis Committee of the International Psychoanalytic Association. In 2017, he received honorary membership in the American Psychoanalytic Association. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Louis Rose.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? All right.
Yes.
Yes. Great. Yes.
Wanted to be sure of that first. I apologize as my eyes move from one side of the screen to the other as I look at what I've prepared and as I look back at all of you. It is a real privilege and a pleasure to participate in this symposium on Sergio Benvenuto's book, Conversations with Lacan, 7 lectures for understanding Lacan. It creates an opportunity that I've been looking forward to for a long time. I worked with Sergio on the translation of articles that he contributed to American Imago, but we were never able to meet and talk in person. Although this virtual symposium is still not a meeting in the full sense of the word, I'm now finally able to see and hear Sergio. And I'm very pleased to have that chance. One of the reasons I was pleased to see his book was, as he's pointed out already, the title, which intrigued me. From the title, I could see that the book dealt with what has always been, for me, a key issue in the work of Jacques Lacan, the problem of dialogue. My presentation here will focus on how Sergio explores that problem throughout his book. At the outset, though, I want to make a few clarifications. First, when I speak of dialogue in Lacanian theory, I'm not referring to any particularities or difficulties associated with Lacan's terminology or with methods of presentation. Instead, I'm using the term in a very wide, everyday sense as the mutual exchange and discussion of ideas, insights, and information within a shared community. I want to emphasize, however, both aspects of that ordinary usage of the term. Not only the role of exchange and discussion in dialogue, but also the significance of shared community. In ancient Athens, for example, what we now refer to as free speech meant, as the ancient historian M.I. Finley has pointed out, free speech within the Athenian assembly. Engaging in speech and engaging in citizenship were linked to each other. The existence of such a link is not surprising. At the root, the term dialogue refers, at least in part, to words crossing between people and thus producing points of contact. Secondly, I want to clarify that I think Sergio's title did more than simply announce what I think is the question of dialogue as a theme in his book. The first part of the title, what we would call before the colon, refers to conversations with Lacan. The subtitle, however, shifts focus to lectures on Lacan. And that distinction is not, I think, entirely accidental. The contrast between what comes before and after the colon, between conversations and lectures, points to the question of dialogue as a crucial dilemma in Lacan's theory. That dilemma, I would argue, is present as one of the underlying concerns throughout Sergio's book. At most point, that concern remains implicit, but at one point, I'll argue, it emerges explicitly as one of the book's defining questions. The problem of dialogue in Lacan, or the problem of how the problem of how dialogue functions in Lacan's theory, has implications, I think, for how we interpret and apply Lacan's ideas. Those implications can be stark. As far back, again, as the ancient world, the study and use of dialogue has provided one of the foundations for radical thought. Ossification sets in when dialogue ceases. Sergio's first chapter introduces his concern, I would say, with the dilemma of dialogue within Lacan's theory. Here he describes Lacan's conviction that theoretical formulations should have the immediate impact of actions. Benvenuto writes, Lacan considers his own theory a performative analytical act. Sergio then characterizes Lacan's conception of theorizing as theory action. Further, Benvenuto explains that in Lacanian theory, healing occurs not through the relation between therapist and patient, as in relational theories, but instead through an experience of sudden clarification or wordless illumination. In other contexts, we might characterize such an experience as a moment of epiphany or even shock. Lacan would describe that experience as a patient confronting the inevitable opaqueness of language or signifiers. As Benvenuto explains this phenomenon, patients in that moment encounter the surplus of meaning that attach to their mental lives. In this regard, as Benvenuto points out, Lacanian theory shows a similarity to other non-Freudian approaches that also emphasize therapy as in part, in Sergio's word, ineffable exchange, or an exchange in which, again, as Sergio describes, word is diminished. Lacan's conception of theory as action and his emphasis on moments of illumination have a close connection, I think. They reflect Lacan's theoretical emphasis on immediate experience or on an experience that cannot be conveyed meaningfully through speech. They de-emphasize or even devalue theorizing as a stimulus to dialogue. Further, they reflect Lacan's understanding of human freedom as necessarily involving a condition of isolation. These theoretical implications of the dilemma of dialogue in Lacan remain, I would say, among the core concerns in Sergio's book. I began by saying that that concern with the meaning of dialogue in Lacan remains chiefly implicit throughout the book. How then is that concern evident in the chapters that follow the first? In the first place, I think it appears as part of the overall organization of the book. Each chapter, I would argue, is shaped around a question that centers on dialogue. The second chapter, for example, deals with whether dialogue about Lacan, given the condition of psychoanalysis as a whole, still has relevance for current cultural and intellectual debates. The third chapter explores whether Lacanians and contemporary scientists, in particular cognitive scientists, can maintain a productive dialogue with each other. The book then shifts from questions concerning communication within or between professions to questions that apply to communication between individuals, whether as analysts, as patients, or as social and political creatures. Most importantly, however, throughout the book, Sergio explores how Lacan understands subjectivity, how that understanding manifests itself in various aspects of Lacan's theory, and how subjectivity as a concept guides Lacanian research, clinical therapy, and philosophic reflection. In the background to this subject, to this discussion of subjectivity, I would argue, is a concern with the dilemma of dialogue in Lacanian theory. In the chapter on the Lacanian division between the symbolic and imaginary orders, Sergio provides a succinct statement of the importance of subjectivity in Lacan's psychological work. He, Lacan, is interested in reconstructing the history and structure of each subjectivity, end quote. Benvenuto stresses the strictness with which Lacan confined himself to that project. And I quote again, "The others that we take for granted, all the others who are not myself, actually have no place in Lacan's system." In the chapter on après coup and alienation, Sergio examines the connection between language and subjectivity in Lacan's theory. According to Lacan, persons use language to identify and comprehend the connections between the disparate events in their lives. In this way, language not only offers the means to establish a coherent connection to external events, but also sustains a sense of inward psychological coherence. For Lacan, language produces in us the consciousness of our independent, subjective relation to the world and to others, and it keeps the consciousness of our subjectivity at the center of our experience. By doing so, it establishes a structure within which we perceive and carry on our lives. It instills in us what could also be described as a sense of personal destiny. As Benvenuto explains, according to Lacan, quote, "It is impossible to stand outside language," end quote. Yet, as Benvenuto points out in the book's concluding chapter, that emphasis on language does not lead Lacan to emphasize the psychological or intellectual significance of dialogue between people. Thus, with regard to Lacan's interpretations of letters and letter writing, Benvenuto writes, "Here Lacan seems to fall back into a communicational vision of language by which human beings exchange messages. Yet the pure Lacanian signifier is by no means a message," end quote. At this point, I would say Benvenuto's concern with the dilemma of dialogue in Lacan becomes explicit. On the final page of the book, Benvenuto recounts the story of how Heraclitus responded to strangers who were taken aback by the philosopher's poverty. He did not reject or ignore them, but instead convinced them to stay and speak with him by his hearth. Benvenuto describes the psychoanalytic movement as, at its origins, an encounter between strangers. And as an example of that early encounter, he recalls the case of Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. Even Einstein, Benvenuto writes, wanted to meet Freud, and the two began a famous correspondence on the subject of peace and war, end quote. Their exchange, as Benvenuto indicates, built on what concerned them both as citizens. The conclusion of the book, however, draws attention to the dilemma of dialogue, not only within Lacan's theory in particular, but within the Lacanian and psychoanalytic movements as a whole. It calls for Lacanians, psychoanalysts, and psychological scientists to engage in a new dialogue. Such dialogue must overcome the sense of being strangers to each other. Benvenuto's book both indicates the openings for dialogue or new dialogue and warns of obstacles to it. Based on Benvenuto's approach to Lacan, what would I see as important openings for dialogue? First, I, for one, think neuroscience has provided a healthy shock to the system of psychological theory and research. Now, Lacanians, as well as other psychoanalytic psychologists, can demonstrate the concept of subjectivity, or how the concept of subjectivity is intellectually meaningful and practically useful in various types of research and therapy. Second, Lacanians can continue to help psychologists along the path of studying the structural foundations of thought and emotion, and help keep them on that path. Finally, Lacanians, as well as other practicing psychoanalysts, can continue to advance dialogue about the most effective and productive methods of clinical intervention. Where do obstacles to new dialogue exist? I'll focus here on issues that I think Benvenuto raised in connection with Lacan. First, a tendency toward intellectual self-isolation should not be equated with a concern for subjectivity, either in theory or in practice. Second, a focus on language as providing the structural framework of interaction with the world and with others should not devalue the social significance and transformative potential of dialogue within that structure. And finally, Lacanians should continue to explore, as Sergio does, the nature of our engagement with the world and with others. Advancing such engagement is one of the crucial goals of both theory and therapy. As the ancient Greeks understood, dialogue reflected, reaffirmed, and widened a sense of shared community. Conversations with Lacan crystallizes for me not only the essential insights of Jacques Lacan, but also, and just as importantly, the insights of Sergio Benvenuto. I should apologize, however, before I finish for any errors or misunderstandings, of which there must be more than a few, that I have in regard to both Lacan's and Sergio's insights. But having said that, I think Sergio is one of those contemporary psychologists, psychoanalysts, and thinkers, among whom I would include Elizabeth Roudinesco, who has adapted and sometimes even rescued Lacan for later generations. And he has done so in part by reviving the concept of dialogue. He has shown that the Lacanian emphasis on the significance of language and subjectivity need not exclude a concern for the meaning of engagement with the world or an interest in the significance of dialogue with others. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I can attest to the value of dialogue with Sergio. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Personal thanks to Sergio.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lou.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Luis.
Okay, let's continue. Up next is Emma Lieber. So Emma Lieber is a psychoanalyst in New York City and part-time faculty in literary studies at the New School. She's the author of The Writing Cure with Bloomsbury, published just last year, and has written for Cabinet, The Point Magazine, Lit Hub, New England Review, the Massachusetts Review, and our very own European Journal of Psychoanalysis, among many others. Please join me in welcoming Emma Lieber.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Quite
okay,
well.
So thank you for Thank you, Fernando and Sergio and EJP for inviting me to speak. I've been working with Sergio in a number of contexts for a few years, and he is a real model for me about on how to be a Lacanian, or any Ian really, and also a free thinker. So I'm delighted to be speaking. How can a book be a conversation? Or rather, how can it be multiple yet unnumbered conversations? How can these conversations be with someone who can no longer speak? And how can these conversations also be lectures divided into the unlikely number of 7? Who is giving these lectures, where, and from what position? Or are the conversations themselves the lectures? Who is the proper audience of a book on Lacan written by someone who claims not to be a Lacanian? And how can a book that so makes you want to speak and write also gesture insistently at that which never ceases not being either written or spoken? As I write this, I realized that the last time I wrote about a book by Sergio, and I'll say that I always, when I have written about Sergio, I call him Sergio. This is what his writing makes me do, which I think is important. I similarly began with a series of rhetorical questions. This was his 2016 book on perversions, importantly in the plural, which in its very title poses a question, what are perversions, that the book then refuses to answer, at least within the definitional rubric that its title sets up. Evidently, this is how Sergio's writing acts on me. It provokes me into a deconstruction of the book's foundational premises. Indeed, it seems to me that this is what Sergio does as a writer. He asks that his textual performances be submitted to the same procedures to which he submits not only other texts, but also entire theoretical bodies and cultural movements. That is, he opens his writing up to be taken up by the kind of play in which he himself engages, and he implies both the entry points for such openings and the methods for such engagements without submitting his work to that metatextual or deconstructive procedure. Whereas other similarly inclined writers might deconstruct their own work for us, Sergio seems to be aware that to do so would be to enclose his text in a hall of mirrors that would ultimately do nothing or little for the transmission of psychoanalysis. This then is the generosity of Sergio's texts, which are neither purely constitutive nor purely performative, but somewhere between the two, a positioning that allows the works to ask for co-conspirators to continue their project, to play with him in both senses, much as the with in Conversations with Lacan can be understood in various ways. We can further variously understand this writerly and theoretical positioning as it relates both to the transmission of psychoanalysis and to Lacan in particular, as the book itself does. This is a book about Lacan not because Lacan produced ahistorical truths about the human psyche, but because, more insistently than other psychoanalytic thinkers, he evinced the notion that psychoanalysis is not a body of knowledge, but a performative procedure, a way of acting in relation to both the possibilities and impossibilities of subjectivity. Lacan's psychoanalytic inventions, object A, the Borromean rings, the synthome, were not just ways of describing something about human life, but open objects of investigation for his audience to play with. They were not just content, but let's say gifts of content produced in service of putting others to work. In this sense, Lacan, in his speaking and writing, put himself in the position of an Alexand, who produces not transcendent truths, but speech objects to be put into play. And yet if, in so doing, he interpolated his readers and listeners as analysts, he also pushed them to become analysands in turn, by producing their own textual and linguistic performances to be gifted to the circuit of psychoanalytic transmission. In some strange way, in one's relation to Lacan's work, one takes up the position of analyst not authoritatively or finally, but fleetingly, as part of a dialectical movement between analyst and analysand, where one perpetually finds oneself called upon by the theories one both receives and produces. Sergio takes up the mantle of this project as it underscores what is always at stake with so-called founders of discursivity. As Sergio writes, quote, "What makes a thinker great is not the fact that he or she has discovered definitive truths, but the fact that his or her ideas have the right rhythm, the rhythm that leads many of us to think." And he continues, quote, "What the master really transmits is not so much a formal thinking, but a certain style of being in the world," end quote. Whether it is by way of the rhythms of thought or of being, theory is transmitted not as content, but as rhythm, not as sense, but as style. And it is via reading Lacan that one, or Sergio, or some of us, comes to articulate these meta-theoretical claims, though of course it is also possible to get there by other routes. In this sense, Lacanian thought, as Sergio's book transmits it, exists somewhere in between theory and meta-theory, in that it asks its recipients not so much to repeat its claims as to articulate its latent assumptions, thus moving the theory to a new register, much as Lacan himself did with Freud and others. Thus, it is by employing Lacan's methods that the content of his thought is transcended, a process that Sergio, in imitation of Lacan's invention of neologisms, calls erasing. A combination of raise and erase. To erase a word, a text, a doctrine, or a cultural movement is to give it new sense by shifting upwards the register of its articulation, an action that Sergio likens to the movement from symptom to synthome in Lacanian thought. This then is how Sergio implicitly conceives the book that he has produced, which is a product not of a dyed-in-the-wool ideological Lacanianism, which, according to Sergio, tends to miss the performative rhythmic nature of transmission that Lacan himself promoted, but of an imitation of Lacan's methods. And it is via such an imitation that Sergio erases what he calls his symptom, that is, his love of Lacan, into a synthematic text. I hope you should hear in this neologism erase and its application the complex movements of text and context in Sergio's thought, the twisting weft of imitation, appropriation, and inspiration with new meaning. Sergio apes Lacan's invention of neologisms in order both to articulate the meta-discursive movements of Lacan's thought and to subject that thought to the same procedure, a procedure which Sergio then elucidates by going back down a level to the content of Lacan's theory of the synthome. And yet the synthome is already a construction that recursively articulates the upward movement to which Sergio's neologism refers. It's a circuitous route that is reminiscent of the moment early in the book in which Sergio asks, of all of the post-Freudian appropriations of Freud, ego psychology come relationism, Kleinianism come object relations, and Lacanianism, which is the real Freud? And then answers or refuses to answer by offering a three-ring parable from the Middle Ages. In this parable, says Sergio, a father and a family that for generations has passed a magic ring from father to favorite son loves each of his three sons equally, and so makes two identical copies of the ring. Thus, the three sons each think they are in possession of the authentic ring, and there's no saying who really has it. The parable was reproduced in Lessing's play Nathan the Wise to refer to the presumed hegemony of the three monotheistic religions. This is how we must understand collective claims to Freud's legacy, says Sergio, who then goes on to say that he doubts Lacan would have liked the parable, since he claimed Freud's ring just as insistently as anyone else. Unless, adds Sergio, quote, we think that Nathan's three rings were a premonition of the three Borromean rings, which obsessed Lacan in the last decades of his life, end quote. What is going on here? Sergio invokes a medieval parable about transmission as a way of relativizing Lacan's body of thought against Lacan's own manifest wishes. And yet this parable then becomes an analogy for an element of Lacanian thought that itself articulates something of the very relativity at stake. The twistings and retwistings of content and form, referent and analog, original and successor, citer and cited, or perhaps most broadly signified and signifier, continue ad infinitum as Mobius strip. This process then operates similarly to how, to turn the screw once more, Sergio articulates the status of Lacan's witticisms when he refers to the conceptual slipperiness of one of the most famous of them. As he says, quote, the signifier represents the subject to another signifier, sounds like a definition, but it only sounds like one. This is because in a definition, the definiendum, or that which needs to be defined, in this case, the signifier, cannot appear in the definiens as one of the words it defines, end quote. In a sense, the entirety of Sergio's book, at both macro and micro levels, from its dealings in the specifics of Lacanian thought to its critiques of entire intellectual movements, works according to this twisting anti-definitional logic, by which a register of discourse is transcended only to be returned to and repeated, this time with the residues of new meaning afforded by that return. There is an important question to be asked, and that I think isn't asked often enough within psychoanalytic publishing, about what it means to write psychoanalytically. That is, not so much what it means to write about psychoanalysis, which of course can and does easily happen under the heading of scholarship or research or university discourse, but what it means to write as an analyst, or to write while attending to the analytic position in relation to one's writing. Sergio's e-raising, as an articulation of both the method and the content of the text, points to one such conceptualization of properly psychoanalytic writing. The action of e-raising further as a description of psychoanalytic method is also inherently social, and indeed part of what's notable about Conversations with Lacan, not surprisingly given its title, is how sociable it is. This book has many friends. Sergio brings us into a world of debates and colloquies with colleagues from various fields, always with a love that is both palpable and formal, in that so many, even those with whom the book takes issue, are included in the game. He gives us a sense of his community, of his playmates, of who takes what position on what side of what debate. For him, theory is not trans-historical, but local and social. It takes place among groups of real people in bodies living out their enjoyments together. Often these anecdotal reports of other people's theories and even lives are used as analogy or reference point for some other train of thought that Sergio is pursuing. For example, Sergio speaks of Joseph Rotblat, a young Polish physicist who was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for escaping from the US in order to avoid participating in the development of the nuclear bomb, and with whom Sergio was well acquainted. And he speaks of him as a way of articulating the difference between ethics and technique in psychoanalysis. It's a subtly complex maneuver, of which you can see there are many in the book, in which the justification for the analogy is both structural and absolutely coincidental. That is, that Sergio happened to know this person. Perhaps in their own way, such moments give form to the relationship between chance and necessity in psychoanalysis. But they also mean that we learn a great deal about Sergio himself, his background, who he did his doctorate with, Laplanche, his intellectual and affective proclivities, which he both performs and makes explicit, since, like a good analysand, or possibly like a well-analyzed hysteric, he includes himself in the scene of his gossip. And by putting himself in the scene, by making himself an object like all the others whom he admires and analogizes and differentiates and critiques, Sergio is inherently self-ironizing. Take, for example, his admission that he doesn't even particularly think that Kleinian or Bionian or whatever theories are wrong. They're just boring. Whereas, quote, when I read or listen to a smart Lacanian, I enjoy it a lot more than when I read or listen to a smart Bionian. Of course, Sergio adds, I am bored by all those who are not smart, whatever their theoretical credo may be. Today, not feeling bored is rare in psychoanalysis, end quote. This announcement would be somewhat horrifying, there but for the grace of God bore I, if it weren't so self-ironizing. And this irony, applied equally to persons and to theories, is then itself an application of the psychoanalytic ethic, in the sense that, as Sergio writes, psychoanalysis allows us to, quote, adopt an ironic position with regard to the signifier we actually are. The simultaneous independence and sociality of Sergio's writerly and theoretical positioning is psychoanalytic as well. And it's here, I believe, that the tension between the singular and the multiple, as it plays out in the book, between the lecture and the conversation, finds its center. Sergio's book may have many friends, but it also insists that, quote, it is important for psychoanalysis to fight alone, end quote. Thus, in the book, psychoanalytic theory takes on the same position among its theoretical playmates, Marxism, religion, physics, chaos theory, etc., that the analyst, made as such by virtue of the end of her analysis, takes on vis-a-vis her community. That is, psychoanalysis, like the analyst herself, is both extroverted, as Sergio says, quote, for Lacan, the end of analysis is not introverted but extroverted, end quote, and irreducibly alone. It seems to me that this tension between singularity and plurality is then internal to psychoanalytic practice as well, and in some way articulates the relationship between psychoanalytic ethics and psychoanalytic technique, or the ways in which ethics finds its place within and determines technique. As I've recently learned from David Lichtenstein, Lacan's direction of the treatment paper centers precisely on a certain tension in psychoanalytic work between centrifugal and centripetal forces, or between openness and restriction. Whereas technically the analyst can say virtually anything, her ethical orientation cannot waver from the rigorous singularity of the psychoanalytic position, which singularity then points a direction from within the infinite range of potential speech. It is here that the question of the clinic opens up, and indeed Sergio writes that what he calls his own deconstructive piety vis-a-vis Lacan, to the extent that it is transmitted, might, quote, also influence the clinical approach of practicing analysts, end quote. Though he adds that, quote, we will not have space to prove it in this work, end quote. If there's one thing I would like to hear from Sergio today, it centers on this question of the influence of his particular reading of Lacan on the clinic, and of the effect, expected, hoped, fantasied, of conversations with Lacan on practicing analysts within their practices. Lacan was out to make analysts, and part of the implicit claim of Sergio's book is that it is via a transmission of the method, rhythms, and turns of Lacan's project, as much as of its content, that an analyst, who then may or may not choose to call herself a Lacanian, might be produced. For my part, I believe that what Sergio's book allows or inspires in its readers is an articulation of their own particular, specific, which also means embodied, thus implying a relation to the real, relationship to theory, with a suggestion that it is from within such an articulation that psychoanalytic work can proceed. To provide my own anecdote, it's now happened to me several times that I've gotten profoundly disoriented after hearing a particular signifier in session with a patient. With one patient, the signifier was cash. With another, it was trick. With another, peel. All three times, I've had the strange and momentary fantasy that this signifier was the patient's name, even though I knew that their names had nothing to do with those words. And yet, in a way, these signifiers were their names. And indeed, one patient, after making mention of his peculiar agility with peeling oranges, named himself precisely this way. As he said, all the Kowalski brothers are excellent at peeling fruit. Now, I could consult Lacan the master about what a so-called master signifier is and give a lecture about it. Or I could, as I have come to do, understand Lacan's idea of the master signifier as a word that, when it emerges in a session, makes me dizzy and confused in this very particular way. I bring this up because Sergio's book has given me a way to think this kind of vignette as itself a registration of theory, such that theory becomes an e-raising of clinical experience that, in the next round, becomes integrated back into the clinic. This, I think, is the place where the lecture becomes supplemented by the conversation. And it is here that something of the relation between the symbolic and the real, as Sergio captures it in his book, comes to life. In other words, the real makes its presence felt not only in the content, but also in the form of Sergio's telling. He performs in the form of his transmission the chiasmatic dance of symbolic and real, of the trans-historical and the local, embodied and specific. That is his essential subject, and that is where the subject as such emerges. This indeed may be the only way to transmit something of the real as it centers a psychoanalytic session within a verbal context, which means that theory must needs engage the radical irreducibility of an encounter or missed encounter with the real that it also describes, bringing theory vertiginously close to something like autobiography. It's also a very funny method of transmission. If this is how you talk about what a master signifier is, then a master signifier as a piece of theory becomes inherently absurd. Theory mimics its subject here not because of some pure principle of imitation, or because we like to think an owner looks like its dog, but because a theory is produced in the same way all verbal performances are produced. Any theory of the signifier must then be as ironic in its relation to the real as the signifiers it both describes and trades in. Sergio opens up this absurdist register of theory making, and it's here as well that the place of Lacan in English translation, and perhaps especially for me in the American context, clarifies itself. It seems to me that American Lacanians, for various cultural reasons, perhaps having to do with their outsiders' relation to the continental tradition, may be especially inclined to take on an ironic position vis-a-vis their own status under the signifier Lacanian. From the other direction, it is perhaps in the context of the current American political stage that we might put to question with particular urgency the relationship between the irony of the signifier, as Sergio's work insists on it, and the status of both identification and of truth. Certainly in America in general today, we have problems with truth, with group identifications, and with irony understood in its most serious dimension. So this is one other thing that I was hoping Sergio and perhaps the rest of us could discuss today. That is the place of something like truth within a psychoanalytic theory that takes seriously the ironies of signification and affiliation, and the possibilities for the social link that emerge from such a theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Okay, 2 more presentations, and then we will go straight into a general discussion after Sergio gives a response to some of the questions and comments that have been put forward so far. Our next presenter is David Lichtenstein, PhD, who is a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City, faculty member at the NYU Postdoc Institute for Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, City University of New York doctoral program in clinical psychology, the New School University, and IPTAR, New York. He is co-editor of the recent book, The Lacan Tradition, with Routledge in 2018, and teaches the course entitled The Clinical Implications of the Work of Jacques Lacan. He's the founding editor of Division Review, a quarterly psychoanalytic forum, and co-founder of a Précu Psychoanalytic Association. Thank you so much, David Lichtenstein, for coming to speak with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lichtenstein.
Thank you. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Sergio, for this wonderful book and for the opportunity to celebrate with you. I've had the good fortune to meet Sergio many, many years ago in New York, and I've been a very interested follower of his work ever since, Sergio. Sergio's exposition invites us to consider psychoanalysis in its history. And the invitation is addressed to us on several levels. Not only the history that is described by the arc of Lacan's teaching and its aftermath, but also the history of the epoch for which psychoanalysis can be taken as a symptom. An epoch we are certainly still a part of, even if our symptomatic relevance is now often put in doubt. Sergio's book also invites us to place psychoanalysis in its history in relation to our own personal history. For my part, I think about how the impact of books like Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization in 1955, a book I haven't looked at for years, confirmed for me as a young student the importance of psychoanalysis, but also introduced the notion that there was a set of philosophical questions related to cultural theory and indeed to the philosophy of history as a human science that were in fact bound up with psychoanalysis. Questions indeed that take us back to the young Hegelians of the early 19th century and Marx's theses on Feuerbach. Marcuse showed respect both for Freud's drives and for a radical theory of logos in that particular Hegelian, Marxist, and Heideggerian blend that he and the other critical theorists of the Frankfurt School and elsewhere represented. This problematic has remained in flux, indeed, since the beginnings of psychoanalysis, and Middle European leftist thought of the early 20th century, and it finds its echoes in Sergio's exposition. As a leftist student in the 1960s, living in the rise and mayhem of American imperialism, equally unmoved by Soviet communism and by its American apologists around whom I grew up, the idea that there were things yet to be found in psychoanalysis and in Hegelian thought propelled me. It initiated an Erfahrung, the drive of my drive, in Sergio's felicitous formulation. Would I say now that when it came to the Freudo-Marxian synthesis, that Marcuse got it right? No. I would rather say, however, that the question misses the point. The great contribution of Marcuse and Adorno, Norman O'Brown, Frantz Fanon, decades ago, was the idea itself that there were important things yet to discover in psychoanalysis related precisely to the interplay of logos and the psychoanalytic drives. The project wasn't over. In this, they were certainly correct, whatever the limits might be of their actual formulations. Indeed, as a project that was essentially over was the way the field of psychoanalysis presented itself in the United States in those years of its psychiatric ascendancy. It was a settled practice. The answers were pretty much known. And the only real question that remained was whether one would choose to submit to the truth or not. All other questions were merely a matter of fine-tuning. I believe that this view of a settled clinical science, even more than the particularities of that science, i.e. what we now call ego psychology, is the real basis of Lacan's critique of American psychoanalysis of that dominant mid-century period. In this, I would say, Lacan was already working with a certain critical theory of history. Whether we chose to call it Marxist or Hegelian is another debate. It is a theory that puts in doubt the closure that clinical practice tends towards. This doubt is radical and constitutive of the subject as related to the not all of the real, something Lacan articulated most clearly in the 1970s, but which was implicit in his work long before then. Somehow, the critical theorists were able to convey in their own way that the settled practice was problematic, and that there was a great deal yet to be worked out regarding psychoanalysis and its potential as a radical praxis of the human subject. Why did they think so? What allowed them to see that the idea of the psychoanalytic drive is so disruptive to the dominant view of the self-conscious social subject, that it contains the potential to decenter and subvert the idea of normative social adjustment that was threatening to establish itself as the ethic of mental health, mainstream psychoanalysis included. When Sergio argues for a certain animality in order to temper Lacan's logocentric tilt, it brings to my mind, at least, Norman O'Brown's chapter entitled The Resurrection of the Body in his book Life Against Death of 1959. Of course, the argument then occurred in an entirely different context and debate. Nevertheless, the argument is not only about the logic of psychoanalysis, but also about its limit, as represented in this instance by the source of the drive as the subversive being of the body. Questions return, but they never return to the same place, and thus are not exactly the same question. A point Sergio makes as well regarding Lacan's return to Freud. The journey is a series of loops. repeatedly returning and never to the same place. Repetition demands the new, as both Kierkegaard and Lacan tell us. Lacan's teaching itself had this character of apparent repetition. Again and again, one encounters him asserting that he has been saying something, he has been saying the same thing all along, that he's repeating a formulation that he has been making for years. And yet, somehow, one hears it as different this time. It comes in a new context and in relation to new formulations that he's working on, and that give the same assertion some new meaning. Lacan's thought loops back on itself like one of his topological figures, indeed like a cross cap, a self-intersecting projective plane. Lacan intersected his own theorization when he returned to Freud to find something new. Ever a Heraclitean return, as Sergio noted. So, with Sergio, I read Lacan to be reminded of the interesting questions and to be amused and encouraged by his formulations, especially as they go up in smoke in front of your eyes. He never fails to find the question nor to offer amusing formulations that invite one to struggle with the implications and their impasses. It is important for the psychoanalyst to engage in this struggle. It exercises one's thinkings in ways that make for better psychoanalysis. But it is important, and I think Sergio does a superb job of conveying this, to recognize that reading Lacan so as to find the final, true formulation, the place where he finally works it out and presents the whole truth of psychoanalysis, is a profound misreading. Even the concept of the signifier, that essential device in the Lacanian toolbox, turns out not to be as solid as some make it out to be. We know its linguistic provenance, but we also know that Lacan put it into service in ways that Saussure never intended, and that the linguists of Lacan's time, Benveniste, Greimas, Jacobson, never entirely embraced. What is less clear is whether the essential Lacanian turn, what we call conventionally the primacy of the signifier, continues to mean the same thing as Lacan returns to it in his later formulations. Thus, the idea that the signifier operates in a web of other signifiers comes into play with another idea, that the signifier makes a cut in the real. That is, that it has a new effect, or indeed an effect on the new. In this latter function, the signifier leaves behind the field of logos and enters trauma as that upon which signification falters. In this way, the signifier itself falters. Indeed, we find Lacan returning to an examination of the sign itself. Imagine that, not the signifier, just as he returned to the concept of identification when he introduced the idea of the symptôme in the last few years of his teaching. These returns and the reversals that we can find in them tell us more about how to use Lacan's thought, and indeed how to read his earlier work, than the stable formulations that are presented in the textbooks, which we can now consult to study a settled Lacanian system. I think Sergio recognizes this point when he writes that, quote, Lacan, who had begun with a logocentric subversion of psychoanalysis in his later years, really returned to Freud, with a play on the word really. But I disagree with Sergio that this return is a product only of his later years. In this sort of periodic reading of Lacan that we now get, i.e., that there's a third period of his teaching, being the period of Lacan and the real, I maintain instead that it took time and repetitions, the looping back that I'm talking about, for Lacan to work out the implications of his earlier formulations, and that end is in the beginning. And indeed, that work of returning and re-looping is not yet done. When Lacan taught us that Freud's substitution of Boltraffio when trying to remember the name Signorelli illustrates the arbitrary character of the sign relation and the slippage that inevitably occurs between signifier and signified, he gave us a great gift. Those were conceptual tools not available to Freud. But when we open that gift, what we find is not a set of stable tools, but something more like Russian dolls that we are still unpacking. After all, what actually took place in the little village of Trafoy when Freud received the bad news of his patient's death remains as an ultimatum behind the chain of signifiers that lead him to recall it. I think this relates to Sergio's idea of something animal-like, the Zoe that Sergio links to the ultimatum of the drive rather than the primacy of the signifier. It is there already in one of the initiatory stories of the psychoanalytic literature, but it is only in the history of rereading that its place there can be invented. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you to all that have presented so far. I will now give a short intervention. However, I do want to preface my remarks by saying that I feel like I'm just going to be echoing so much of what has already been said before. And I think the actual title of my talk or intervention gives a sense of, in fact, what I'm saying in terms of echoing. So it's simply put, playing with Lacan. So I ask, what is it that we are here to witness? Yet another introductory text regarding Lacan? A reformulation of Lacan for a North American English-speaking audience, formalizing his concepts, cohering in a bridged and seamless totality that serves to alienate our esteemed theoretical cousins only further. Gladly, I am able to give a firm no to all these questions, for Benvenuto's book is one of the few texts in English on Lacan that dares to play with him, to toy with him, to take him at his word, and then to take it further. A foreplaying, if you will. I want to be absolutely clear. We do not need any more introductory texts on Lacan. We already have way too many. If anything, the intense surfeit of introductory texts already in existence speaks a symptom. Like the par lettre, the signifying flesh that lays on our couches, this corpus of introductory texts that have arrived on our shores in the last 25 years speaks of suffering, a wanting to be heard. But to be frank, this discourse has often fallen flat in the US. It has served, and to be fair, it has been used to disparage the great gifts that a Lacanian approach to clinical work brings. Please note, I am not speaking here of how Lacan can be used to analyze films, fiction, conspiracy theories, QAnon, or the political economy of Kansas. In this moment, I am referring precisely to, and only to, the import of Lacan for the actual clinical practice of psychoanalysis. The always fraught, vexed, impossible, and hopelessly hopeful act, yes, act, as others have noticed, of listening to another's pained articulation of their truth. Of course, many other texts on Lacan in English, sometimes treated, this is Lacan, as if he were a stretch of land, conquered and rendered decipherable, mappable, worthy of navigational instruments, have indeed been important. But it has been often the case that their formality, their rush to provide totalizing accounts, has stripped away what is most essential about his thought. The playfulness that provokes, the performance that doubles back on itself to reveal something about you, the listener, the reader, the interlocutor. The end result of this sed ad explicare, this somber rush to provide the exhaustive explanation of his work, has been a certain perceived pompousness, coupled with an ecclesiastical fixation on a sequestered and cloistering lingo that has alienated many of our non-Lacanian clinical colleagues. Who needs a coronavirus when you have this insufferable version of Lacan to keep us all distanced from each other? The grand and welcome gift of Benvenuto's book is that it brings Lacan's playfulness into our midst, into the English-speaking clinical world. By virtue of its liveliness, it brings our theoretical cousins, the relational, intersubjective, Kleinian, Bionian, Winnicottian, and the, quote, post all previous psychoanalytic thinkers crew, end quote, into conversation with the body, mischievous, and yet deadly serious Lacan that we encounter in Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and French. In this way, it is a landmark work. It establishes a Lacan worthy of engagement on our shores. But what do I mean by play, playing, toying? For several years, I worked with children in clinical practice. Small children, mind you. What's interesting is they were always ready to do the work. They were always ready to play. But we regard play, that signifier, with our adult sensibilities, thereby ignoring that the play of children is something terribly serious. Something was being worked out in those sessions with devastating consequences. To interfere with that was nothing less than deleterious. Their lining up of exactly those little trucks and cars in that particular sequence with that specific color scheme was the quickening of subjectivity made manifest. They were inventing themselves, assembling the elements given by the other before my very eyes and ears. I was there as yet another prop to be toyed with, to be used, and then to be spat out. This is what I am getting at and what Benvenuto does with Lacan. To use him so as to get rid of him, for that is the point. It is certainly not the refusal of invention and thinking disguised as the veneration of a master that rules so many corners of our field. January 6th showed us where that attitude can take us. We have no use for mobs in psychoanalysis. The Anglo-American world of psychoanalysis can benefit richly from these 7 lectures. Funny number that, 7. It is the first number whose pronunciation in English contains more than 1 syllable, not counting 0. The Pythagoreans found the number particularly noteworthy because it consisted of the union of the physical, which is the number 4, and the spiritual, which is the number 3. In other words, it is grounding, and it takes us beyond the beginning, the 1, which is exactly what Benvenuto's book in English does for us now. what it pretends for Anglo-American psychoanalysis. It dismisses the unified, reified, systematized, integrated Lacan that has sadly taken hold in North America, and by returning to a return, hands us the polymorphous, riven, differentiated lines of flight version of the voluptuous signifying machine that was Lacan. But now that this has been published, this book, what happens? Particularly when we bear in mind the landscape of institutional psychoanalysis, the psychoanalysis born of schools. Where does this book land or find a place? Clearly, it falls outside of the doxa of institutions. It cannot be absorbed. It functions as an outlier, and as such, it would seem to signal something grim about the present and future of psychoanalysis in both its IPA and Lacanian variants. Works like this book find no easy place in this terrain. So, is this all we can hope for? Psychoanalysis in a neoliberal key, the iron law of our time? Beyond this symposium, for as lovely as it is, and the reviews in leading journals, what is the future of this book and what it brings to life? It would be all too easy to suppose that psychoanalysis, like seemingly so much else at this time, has taken a dark turn. That what we are witnessing is the end of this grand experiment initiated by Freud. But I would argue that this prognosis has always been on offer. The death of psychoanalysis has been anticipated since its very inception. I suspect that there is a type of comfort that is obtained from this sort of divination. But as I've said elsewhere, psychoanalysis thrives not because of psychoanalytic institutions, but in spite of them, which is why we require them. What is essential about psychoanalytic theory and practice is most often conveyed not in psychoanalytic schools, for as much as they are necessary, but via other means, including efforts like this book that cannot find a place, because to land squarely in a preordained box would spell the end of its sparkle and its life. So, let us celebrate the fleeting joys of what Benvenuto has brought to us with this book, for it is already dying, like all good and precious things. And being that this is a symposium, a feast, really, let's revel in this moment. We take our pleasures where we can. The great hope, of course, is that another conveyance will arise and keep the spark alive, a temporal migration that is the veiled grounding of our practice as analysts. Thank you. Okay, Sergio, would you like to respond? And I think your microphone is off. We cannot hear you yet, Sergio. We cannot hear you yet. No. There we go. We can hear you now.
Now it's okay?
Yes, yes.
There was a cut. Okay. How much time do I have for answering?
I would say you even have like 10, 15 minutes if you wish.
15 minutes. Okay, the questions and the provocation were so many, and I don't think that I will be able to ask all the questions or all the, I mean, the problems the speakers raised. I am very, I'm very grateful to all the presenters, because I realized that they read my book. Not only read quickly, but they were able to understand the real important and the questionable points. It seems obvious that when you present a book, you have read the book. Maybe in America it's absolutely obvious, but it's not true. For example, in Europe, in Italy, many persons present a book that they don't read. And I have a sort of a sixth sense to understand if a presenter has read the book or not, because it's a sort of a ritual. And I realized with emotion that it wasn't a ritual. And first of all, I would like to answer to a question which seems to me essential. Maybe if I have time, I will try to answer also to other questions or objections. It's Emma Lieber's question. I think it's essential. If there is one thing I would like to hear from Sergio today, it centers on this question of the influence of his particular reading of Lacan on the clinic and of the effect expected, hoped, fantasized of a conversation with Lacan on practicing analysts within their practice. It raises the essential problem of the link between theory and practice in psychoanalysis. I don't know in America, but I teach to many psychoanalytic schools or psychotherapy schools, where we have a lot of young students who wanted to be initiated to the profession, and I think that most of these young persons are not at all interested in theory. No, they think that theory it's something for theoreticians. They would just like to have some input, some information, some training in order to cure people, to be successful psychotherapists or psychoanalysts, and to get a lot of money. They don't care at all about the theory, no? And it's also true that in a certain sense, I don't know if it's also your experience in America, that many colleagues, analysts or psychotherapists are very successful without having any theoretical backgrounds. They're what I would call Trump's analysts. I mean, analysts who don't know anything about theory. They have a very rough theory, but some of these are successful. They have a lot of clients, and I mean, they are they work, they function with the patients. I met people who spend years of psychotherapy with colleagues I despise as colleagues, but they had some good results, no? And of course, this colleague don't have any kind of our theoretical worries we have here in this in this seminar. The point is also that since Freud, it was clear that psychoanalysis is not a scientific psychology. I think that the merit of Lacan was to push on this button that psychoanalysis is not an effective form of scientific psychology. Why? Because Freud said in a very famous lecture that psychoanalysis is an impossible job, an impossible profession, like governing, politics, and educating. I would add also administering justice. I mean, to be a judge, to be an educator, to be a governor, no, and to be a psychoanalyst, according to Freud, were impossible jobs. And their link with science, with the scientific knowledge, is not clear. Can we say that Biden defeated Trump because he was more scientific than Trump? No, we all think that if Biden defeated Trump, it's why he was a winner in order to get in touch with the unconscious of people, no? In fact, what Freud called impossible jobs, impossible works, are all works which deal with the unconscious, the politician. He's not a scientist. He has to convince, to seduce people. I mean, speaking to the unconscious. The educator is the same thing, and the psychoanalyst is the same thing. You know, it means that the psychoanalysis is not based on an episteme. Episteme in Greek was a kind of knowledge, now which is a sort of a scientific knowledge, but it was based on phronesis. Phronesis was translated by the Latin as prudentia, no? Like in jurisprudence, the prudence. And I would say that psychoanalysis is not a scientific psychology. It's not a technical application of a scientific theory. It's not. It's why we cannot talk about a psychoanalytic technique, but rather as a psychoanalytic ethical practice, which is not the same. Psychoanalysis is not scientific psychology, but psychoprudence. But which role theory plays in this psychoprudence? No, this idea that, in a certain sense, theory is not the master signifier of the practice was repeated by many analysts, and Lacan was one of them. Many times, Lacan says, in order to meet a new analysand, when you meet a new analysand, you have to forget completely what you know. No, in a certain way, it's a sort of a Socratic recommendation. If you deal with new patients, you have to forget completely your theory, no? Forget everything you know. But if you have to forget everything you know, what's the utility of theory? Is a theory important in order to be forgotten when you deal with the real cases? Of course, it's not something that just Lacan said. Even Bion is a psychoanalyst who is very popular in Italy, and his sentence is very famous, very popular. Bion recommended erase all memory and desire. When you meet an analysand, you have to think that it's the first time you meet them or you meet her. You have to erase completely all your memory and all your desire. Bion was influenced by Buddhist philosophy. I would say that in certain sense, analysis is the contrary of April, according to Thomas Sterne Eliot, which is the cruelest month. Analysis is a fall, not spring, is a fall of a memory and desire, something hic et nunc, here and now. No? Bion said you have to meet even a patient you follow from years. Each session is hic et nunc. It's the first time you meet this person, no, which is in contrast completely of the Freudian idea of the reconstruction. That analysis, the late Freud thought that instead analysis was a kind of a reconstruction. In this horizon, what's the place of theory? Theory, episteme, is useless. I have to say that also it's a matter of a personal preference. You know, some choose to become analysts because for different reasons. For some, it's a way to help people, like nurses, like doctors. Why not? For others, it's a way to cure people in a very sophisticated way. It's a successful cure. And for others, it's also a way, especially for Freud and for Lacan, it was a way to understand something essential about the human being. Huh? It's why sometimes, you know, colleagues don't do the same job, essentially. I am, because I'm also a philosopher, for me, psychoanalysis is interesting, important, fascinating, because it's the way to understand really, finally, human beings. Other ways are masks, no? But for others, it's not important. They wanted to be Trump's analysts. Huh? But in which sense Lacan and others, or Bion, are true when they say that we have to forget theory, memory, and even desire. Desire is impossible, because I think that what's important in any kind of transference is the fact that the analyst infects his or her client with his or her desire to analyze. The analyst has a very strong, terrible desire to analyze. He cannot live sometimes without analyzing, and this desire to analyze sooner or later, I mean, infects like coronavirus, no, the analysand, and the transference is possible. It's why I don't share the idea, Beyond's idea, that the analyst has to give up desire. No, he has a kind of super desire. No. But I think that what is true in Lacan's idea, or the others analysis, because it's a sort of a commonplace among important analysts, that in practice you have always to forget your theory. I think that, of course, the students tell me we are bored about theory. We want to know what to do with this specific patient. And I think that, you know, theory is essential, but you have to forget it in order that it works. The real theory is unconscious. Only unconsciously, it means that you have to eat the theory in order that it becomes unconscious, in a sort of a cannibalism of theory, no? And only when you have completely absorbed the theory, it becomes unconscious. There, it can be useful. It's true that Trump's analysts can have some success, no, some specific, but when you deal with the real problematic patients, when patients which push you to touch the real, and it's, I think, the point what we have to consider real. You need the theory, but you have to forget the theory. In a certain way, theory is effective only when it's unconscious. It's why I find very naive a lot of a clinical reconstruction, not only by Lacanians, but also by other schools, who try to demonstrate that in these cases theory works. No, the typical clinical vignette, which is typical of the psychoanalytic genre, which I think absolutely boring and superficial. The analytic vignette are artifacts. No, you can talk about a case if like Freud, like Klein, you know, to write books because vignette, clinical vignette, it's just only propaganda, no, but we don't care about the propaganda, and if you reconstruct a clinical case, you have to show in which way theory unconsciously inspired you the right interpretation. It's why you need the theory in order to ignore theory. It's a paradox. I would even say that in a certain sense, psychoanalysis is an anti-theory. And it's what, in a certain way, Freud said in his most important and most enigmatic and dark paper, which is beyond beyond the last principle. I don't say beyond the pleasure principle, beyond the last principle, where he said that in a certain way, psychoanalysis had to construct an anti-theory. Why? Psychoanalysis, beyond the psychoanalysis, because it's what the death drive. The death drive is what escapes all functional psychoanalytic interpretation. You have to get in touch with something real in the unconscious, and you don't have any interpretation. No, what's the difference finally between Lacanian approach, despite the degeneration of Lacanian cults, and that Lacan understand the self-critique of late Freud of the beyond the pleasure principle or beyond the last principle. No, that in a certain way psychoanalysis is incomplete. Incomplete, I mean, for people who know about mathematics, logic, philosophy, has a very important echo, because the theorem of incompleteness changed completely our world. Gödel proof, and a lot of other are in quantum physics. No, we know that, you know, all this logic, all these theories are incomplete. And Freud, with the beyond last principle, reaches the same point. Psychoanalysis is incomplete, and it's why, as a psychoanalyst, we have to deal with something beyond psychoanalysis. And Lacan said this beyond psychoanalysis, this something which is not functional, no, because the previous psychoanalytic interpretation were in interpretation based on the fact that even symptoms, even depression, all symptoms, dreams, and everything were functional to last principle, to the last principle. No, they were functional. But at a certain point, Freud recognizes that the unconscious, the human being, is essentially dysfunctional. And to be psychoanalyst is not to interpret and to solve problems by interpretation and by the explanation. Some things in human beings are not at all explainable. And the real psychoanalyst has to deal with these unexplainable, which he called the death drive. And I think that Lacan called the real. No, at the end in psychoanalysis, we have to deal with the real. And it's why I think the advantage of Lacan in comparison to other theories who think that in a certain way everything human being is functional, as in cognitive psychology, where bets on the facts that human beings look irrational, no, but basically they are all rational. Even if they behave in a very strange and crazy ways, they are, I mean, there's a reason, no? There's a reason. No, Freud says that, no. At the core of human beings, there's something unreasonable, not explainable. And it's the real job of the analyst in a certain way. Interpretation. Do I have some time more? No.
No, I think we at this point we should open it up. Thank you. But on this very point that you open up, the inexplicable, right? I think is a perfect moment to open it up. But I did want to ask.
Sure.
Emma, did you want to say something to that by way of kicking it off for a larger discussion, since you had prompted the question to begin with?
Well, what I found that I wanted to say actually is that Sergio just helped me understand my parapraxis this morning, which is that early this morning, as though in preparation for this event, I managed to delete all of the files on my computer. And I mean, this is like the horror of my life. This is 20 years of files of my trying to decipher Lacanian theory, all of my registrations, and it was gone. I luckily have a sister-in-law who's an IT person and also a saint, so she walked me through recovering most of it. But this was my way, apparently, of doing the forgetting that you speak about, Sergio.
It was a gift for me. Thank you. No, but I'm kidding.
Okay, so we can do it old school, or we can do it Zoom school. So in terms of going forward with the discussion, so mind you, I am looking at 3 different screens here to be able to look at everyone. So if you want to, you can raise your hand like this, actually physically, or if you look at reactions, when you look at reactions, and then you can see a way apparently of signaling to me. That's another way of going about it. I will then call upon you and then you can speak. So let me see. I did see that there were some hands up already. Whoever put your hand up earlier, could you put your hand up again? So Vasilis, would you?
I think that we have still 20 minutes, I think that.
Oh yeah,
minutes,
in fact, we have like 25 minutes, yes. So okay. Vasilis, would you like to speak? You need to turn. Yes, okay. We can hear you now.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be in a Lacanian discussion, Lacanian group. I always admire this theory, if I may use the word. And I agree with most of the things that Sergio said. However, I always have with Lacanian approach an issue of why certain things appear to be rather complicated, whereas in my mind they are fairly simplified. I take the example of forget everything you know when you approach an analyzant on the couch, all right? Why do you need to forget? I personally would prefer to express, I think, the same thing using the following format. I expect from myself to be so spontaneous and so automatic that theory is of no use to me when I am going to make an interpretation. It is, in other words, the material, the theoretical material, whatever it may be, it has become so embodied and so integrated into me that my words have the right effect without the need of using theory. I want to ask Sergio, does it represent you?
Do I have to answer now?
Yes.
No, okay. I think that each analyst has his or her own way. To deal with his history, his theory, his practice. I think I don't think that there's a general prescription. In a certain way, each analyst he's able to create his own relationship to the unconscious. No, and of course, if you are happy with your way, the point which is more general beyond what you do and what I do, it's the general point of the trick of a theory. It's a little bit more philosophical, in the sense that, of course, all philosophers of science tells that science is not based on facts, but on theories. No, all science is not based on. You need the first theory, and you try to verify if this theory is supported by facts or falsified. All history of science tells that we start from theory, and
but point... you see, there is something which is, I think, vital here. When you say forget everything you know, it's something active. When I advocate, it's something which is perhaps a little bit much more passive. What I say, you say forget, to do a mental act actively. I say I go there and I expect from myself to act spontaneously.
Sure, but I think that it's our aim of everybody. But the forgetting, it's not something active. Forgetting, it's a let go. I think I would say that if I forget my theory, I let go my theory, which sleeps.
Yes, this is not sleeps, forgetting. Therefore, yes. So you come closer to what I...
The point is when the theory awakes again. But it's. I think the link between a theory and the practice is a matter of art. I think one of the best book I read, it was this book by the chemist, philosopher Michael Polanyi, who published a famous book in what he said, but you don't have to believe what scientists publish, because they publish, and it's true also for psychoanalysis. If you read the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, they are written all in the same way. There's a pattern, which is the acceptable mainstream pattern. But Polanyi said that in fact a scientist does not respect at all, I mean, the way he publishes. When he has to publish his results, he has to follow a certain philosophy of the academic scientific journal. But in fact, each scientist knows something which is not demonstrated, but there's a sort of aesthetical practice. It's why Polanyi thinks that science is essentially an aesthetical experience, and I think that even psychoanalysis is an aesthetical experience, but it means that you have to be a good aesthetician. Each of us find the right combination between theory, practice, experience, but no model, no formalized model can tell you have to do like this. Each of us has to find his own way to overcome the dogmatic theory, the idea that you each case you have to apply a scheme. You know, some Lacanians clinical cases are horrible because they're not true. They are just application of from a model. You don't see anything of the real subject. No, and each analyst has to find his or her own style.
His own way. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. And I'm sorry to say just your, okay. So Vaktan Gomelauri.
Thank you.
Would you like to speak? Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sergio and the other presenters. I want to be Trump's analyst for a second. Sergio, you spoke on some political issues, and today all over United States, some armed protesters are gathering to protest Biden's inauguration. And I have a question in the regard of protesting Big Other or being hysterical against Big Other. How is that possible within a Lacanian theoretical framework? Maybe even to go farther and say, how is it possible to be hysteric against a pervert's discourse if society of control is a pervert, or if Biden is a pervert who really doesn't have signification, but likes to smell women's hair and doesn't even have this big Trump logo on top of himself, or violence that Trump has. How can hystericize herself against a pervert? Is that possible? And is this fantasy of pedophile maybe not also a wishful formation to have not only perverted father or be against perverted father, but also to have a castrating father? Thank you so much.
But I don't understand in which sense protest against Trump is hysterical, if I understood.
No, protest against Biden. Now the protests are against Biden.
Against Biden, they are
the liberal establishment, which is the Big Other, so to say.
But why are they hysterical? I don't live in America. Why these protests are hysterical? In which sense they are hysterical?
Well, isn't all protest in a way hysterical, as Lacan says, the demand for a new master, claiming that the power is not castrated properly?
And the Biden would be the new master?
Well, I would say a perverted master in a sense, or Big Other.
Yes, but I remember that when Lacan spoke about the hysterics, he said something important and paradoxical. He said a woman is a woman who a master in order to dominate them. The hysterics, if you know hysterics, women, but even men sometimes. I mean that the exemplary woman is Shakespeare, the theme of the shrew, Caterina. No, Caterina. It's quite interesting because Caterina in this comedy wants to be married. She doesn't say I wanted to stay single. I mean, spinster. No, she wants to be married, but she wants a marriage with the power. No, and the real hysterical demand is a demand. I need a master, no, an apparent master and husband, because I have to dominate them. It's the paradox. If you have experience with historics, it's always this paradox.
But
that,
maybe they are trying to get the government to respond with power, to have a real master who's going to stop them or who's going to come to power with real power.
Maybe, I don't know. I'm not able, I mean, to apply mechanically social events to psychology, I mean, to psychoanalytic. Of course, there's, I think that the real important text we have to deal with, and it's a centenary. It's Master Psychologie und Analyse, psychology of crowds and analysis of the self, which is in a certain way a forgotten text by Freud. It has its limits, but it's a very ambitious attempt by Freud to explain all kind of social life, from small groups or ephemeral groups to very structured, you know, it's a cosmic theory about social life, you know. And we are organizing in Italy a seminar for this centenary, and it's a little bit a forgotten text because why? Because frankly speaking, most of Lacanians are Freudo-Marxist. And this text by Freud is not at all Marxist, not at all. No Marxist can accept Freud's ideas. No, and it's why it's a repressed text. It's a very complex text, you know, but talking about social movements, in a certain sense, Freud says that all politics is based on hypnosis. He had the experience of hypnosis for many years. Social life is the hypnotic side of life. Why? Because in hypnosis, you need the master. And Freud was very skeptical. When Lacan said to young students who contested them, you need the master and you will have it, no, to the students in Vincennes, in a certain way, he repeated Freud's idea that all crowds need a master, a leader, I would say a Führer. Frankly speaking, at that time, the fascism was not, imposed. Freud thought that the basic social link is fascism. In the sense, I know that for Marxists, it's very hard to tolerate this theory, but if you read carefully, without filters and the glasses, this beautiful Freud's text is what clear that the fascism is the essence of all social crowds, and it's why it's a repressed text. All political crowds are promised to fascism. Of course, we avoid fascism when you introduce into a collective something which would say the couple of, because according to Freud, the couple of, like Romeo and Juliet, was antisocial. Freud was romantic. He thought that Romeo and Juliet, Paolo and Francesca in Divine Comedy by Dante, they are the heroes and heroines, the real love between a man and a woman is the death of the society. And it's why, in a certain way, all kinds of society tries to repress sexuality. It's the thesis of civilization and its discontent. No, in a certain way, civilization hates couple, and it's why all civilization tries to recuperate sexuality into the form of family. Yes, if love gives birth to children, I mean, you have the grandparents. Okay, it's completely socialized, but in a certain sense, Freud had this very romantic idea that, in a certain sense, love is Romeo and Juliet, and it's also tragic because it's antisocial.
So, Sergio, so perhaps on that, we can begin to close today's symposium, our feast here together. A couple of points before we finish. First of all, I want to thank Sergio both for his book and for conversing with us today. Much appreciated. This has given us much thought. And I think, actually, to stay very close to what Emma was speaking to, it gives us a lot, in fact, for the clinic itself. So thank you so much. I want to thank all our presenters. Patricia Gherovici, thank you as always. A stunning presentation. Louis Rose, thank you for bringing your erudition to this. Emma, I think you hit on many of the fine points that really matter. David Lichtenstein as well. Your veteran viewpoint on this is much appreciated. Sergio, you wanted to say something additional? Oh, we cannot hear you. No, not yet. We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you. You think you can fix the audio issue again? Okay. Unfortunately, we cannot hear Sergio. So I did want to put on people's calendar. So our next big EJP. Yeah, I can hear you now. Yes.
No, I wish just to say that I'm sorry of not having answered to Patricia's questions, which were very important. I didn't have time, but I will do that maybe personally. I didn't have time to answer to her very, important notice.
And so, so our next big event will be on March 20th. This is in Pacific time, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And we will be doing essentially something very similar to this, focusing on the new translation of Nestor Bronstein's Jouissance, a Laconian Concept, one of the big books to be published in this past year, along with Sergio's. So that'll be 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. The EJP will be sending out more information about that in the next couple of weeks. We look forward to seeing all of you there and your friends. And a couple of other EJP items. We will be releasing the new regular issue of the journal within the next 2 weeks. We were supposed to have released it already, but with everything happening at the Capitol, it just seemed better to just delay it by a little bit so it actually has a place to land. We will also be releasing very soon our special 25th anniversary issue that features Nestor Bronstein, who's also part of this today, and Patricia Gherovici, among many other folks. So thank you everyone for attending, and we will see you soon. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you to all. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye.